The Britain that is going to be forged in the white heat of this revolution will be no place for restrictive practices or for outdated methods on either side of industry.
Education, education, and education.
You start with far-fetched resolution. They are then pickled into a rigid dogma code. And you go through the years sticking to that, outdated, misplaced, irrelevant to the real need.
We've changed the world before, and we're going to change the world again.
Hello and welcome to the Not a Day for Soundbites podcast. In this episode of the podcast, I'm going to be discussing Jim Callaghan's 1976 Monetarist speech with Anthony Broxton, better known on Twitter as Tides of History. Welcome to the podcast, Anthony.
Thank you very much. Pleasure to be on to talk about one of the most interesting and I'm going to say relevant speeches of modern political times. So yeah, pleasure to be here, mate.
It's great to have you on. And like you say, it is probably, particularly at the moment, one of the most relevant speeches that we could think about talking about. For those who aren't familiar with the speech, could you give a bit of context to the background of it?
Yeah, so the speech we're talking about today is the one from October 1976, which is Jim Callaghan at Labour conference in Blackpool, just as the British economy is about to fall off a cliff. I think Dennis Healey, who was the chancellor at the time, said it was the one time he thought that the world was caving in around him. And essentially, it's off the back of a few months of huge run on sterling in Britain. Jim Callaghan's not been prime minister for very long, and he arrives at Blackpool to kind of settle the markets and give a speech which is going to be economy focused. Mm-hmm. So we can go and potentially talk about some of the context of that if we want to. But essentially, you know, it's a speech that has become very famous because of what happens after, because of people see it as potentially opening the door to Thatcherism. Others say he was kind of had foresight that Britain was going to change and it needed to do different things. But it's a really interesting speech, as I say, particularly as we, on the day we record, don't want to date your podcast, but the day we record, It looks as if we're going to have another economic crisis. So, lots to unpack.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, as you mentioned the context of it, I think it's important to think of this speech in that context. It's 1976. Callaghan, like you say, has just become Labour leader and Prime Minister. There have been grapples over industrial action for years preceding this, through 72, 73, 74. There's just been an EU referendum. How much do you think of this was Callaghan thinking about when he was coming to make this speech? How much of the burden of the economy and the burden of the industrial action and Labour's relationship with the trade union do you think was in his mind as the speech was about to be made?
Yeah, it's a really good point because, you know, it's history to us now, the kind of 1970s from this point. But what I always find fascinating is the way in which that kind of fall of the Heath government and things that happened before that just framed the way that they viewed the world. I mean, Callaghan had been around a long time by the time he made the speech. He has the longevity that, you know, a current political leader couldn't possibly have. You know, elected in 1945, serves every great office of state over that 30-year period, which means he's basically seen multiple crises, and he's been there for, you know, some of the big crises. He had to resign as chancellor himself in the mid-1960s over a sterling crisis. He was also there for, you know, the front line when, the miners kind of brought down the Heath government. He was there kind of for the end of the Wilson years. And it frames the way that he approaches this speech. Inflation and unemployment are the two big issues that are on his mind. I tweeted this out when Liz Truss became Prime Minister because I worked out that she was that Callaghan was the last person who went from Foreign Secretary to Prime Minister before her, but also the same crisis. And I think if you compare Liz Truss's opening speech to the country, and I compared it with Callaghan, and Callaghan was much more bleaker speech to the country, and he talked about there is no soft option. I do not promise you any real easement for some time to come, which is like an unbelievable thing for a prime minister to say to voters. There's going to be no real easement for some time to come. I mean, you can't imagine a politician saying that now. They might talk about a little bit of turbulence, as our chancellor has said, but he had the frankness probably, and that's part of his character as well. As he approaches that summer of the economic crisis, that made it kind of different than someone else might have approached it in the party. You know, if it was Tony Benn or Michael Foot, even Dennis Healey, Callaghan had a different view of the world, and it came from probably having that experience and being there, so that when it came to the financial crisis, the economic crisis, he was, experienced and thinking about all these issues.
Absolutely, and thinking about the kind of feelings within the Labour Party at this time, particularly with the economic crisis that was seeming to encircle not just the whole country but the government as well. There was a divide, wasn't there, in Labour as to how there should be how that Labour should resolve the crisis, how they would be able to find a way out of it. You had those who were on the left who were arguing for more of a siege type economy, whereas Callaghan was arguing the opposite. Do you think that that's something that, as he was going in, he was thinking, I've got to make it clear who's leading the Labour Party, and this is the position, regardless of what other parts of the party were saying?
Yeah, it's an interesting point. I think his character was so strong, like his view of the world, probably, that he wasn't going to be swayed by what the party really thought. I mean, he was a very good manager of cabinet. I mean, when Callaghan comes in 1976, we've had a long period of Harold Wilson, who is seen as a bit of a schemer, bit of a game player, someone who you can't really trust, and lots of divides in his cabinet. Callaghan comes in, he's supposed to be a little bit more collegiate. He's got left wingers in the cabinet. They're allowed to speak a bit more. He brings in Michael Foot into a key role, who's seen as someone on the left. Tony Benn is still there, and he's allowed to contribute. Whether he does what they say or not is a different matter. But he kind of gives them the space to argue. So he's got that support of the cabinet on one hand. At the same time, though, he's got memories of his own resignation as Chancellor. And also, I mean, what we've got to remember, it's only about 45 years after the collapse of the Labour government in the 1930s, which, if you go back and read any of the diaries or the cabinet notes or anything, of the 1970s, the Labour figures are obsessed with Ramsay MacDonald's collapse and betrayal, and they still talk about it, about not repeating it and not creating an economic crisis that's so bad they have to go into government with the Tories, which seems weird for us probably, but in reality, it's as close to them as Thatcherism is to us. So it shaped the kind of worldview, and that's kind of on Callaghan's mind as well. Don't want to be the Prime Minister that has to, resign or bring in a government of national unity, or has such a big run on sterling that it never recovers the party and never recovers as a government. So that's where the kind of calls for the belt tightening comes in. Callaghan is not the first to do it. A year before Callaghan makes this speech that we're talking about, Wilson actually makes a speech where he says, "Give us a year for Britain," or something around that line. And what he's saying is, work harder, get paid less, put something in, to the economy, industry, managers and workers work together for 1 year, and let's kill the kind of scourge of inflation and unemployment for good. It seems like a very, idealistic way of looking at it when you know what happens. But it was clearly at the front of those two's mind as this kind of, we approach that autumn of 1976.
Absolutely, and I think one of the things that's really interesting about the speech, particularly in relation, I mean, you brought up the 1930s and the long shadow that was cast there, is that when McDonnell was faced with the Wall Street crash and the economic crisis of the 1930s, he did something that was very much opposite to what was happening in America. He didn't implement a New Deal like FDR because he didn't have the support for it, and it wasn't, there was questions over whether it would work, that kind of thing. And I think there are similar feelings here when Callaghan's discussing monetarism how much of a kind of alien concept was the idea of monetarism to not just the Labour Party, but to the British public at this time?
Yeah, it's a good point. It was kind of around, in like the shadowy think tanks as they're called, and it was an idea which people thought a time had come, and on the kind of right. I mean, the think tanks that were kind of promoting the idea of monetarism were talking to Labour and Conservative politicians about their plans. There were people interested in this idea. Peter Jay, I think, is credited, Callaghan's son-in-law, worked for the Times as a kind of person to kind of introduce this idea to Callaghan and helped write this speech. But I think for Callaghan, it would have been less about monetarism in the way that we would later think it, and more about how, because at the same time as he's talking about, reversing British decline and productivity and modernising industrial relations, he is committed to full employment. And in this speech, he kind of reaffirms that this is the way to do it, which is kind of opposite of what the monetarist viewpoint would probably be. I think in terms of how familiar it was at the time, I think it was still on the very fringes of, British society. Trade union and industrial relations was still the kind of main, way in which people assumed that we were going to get out of this crisis. Fixing those relations between trade unions and business, getting more investment into business, making manufacturing way more competitive on a global scale. That is what Callaghan talks about in this speech all the way through. And he has stats about how, growth GDP has massively declined at the same time that spending on social services that he agrees with have gone up. And he thinks that the only way to do this is to kind of save the manufacturing industry. So it's not about what would later probably be seen as like the Thatcherite monetarist, we kind of have to give up these industries and get new ones. It's more, his philosophy is more about bringing spending down, bringing borrowing down, but actually at the same time revitalizing manufacturing industry so that you can make up for that and can make to full employment. Whether that would have ever been able to happen, we will never know. But there are obviously alternative theories about what Britain could have done in the 1980s, other than what it did do.
Yeah. So now I'm going to introduce a clip from the speech, which we will discuss just after it plays for those listening.
That doesn't mean, when I say there's no other way, that it's going to be quick or easy. That's been promised before. It is neither. Britain has lived for too long on borrowed time, borrowed money, borrowed ideas. And we live in too troubled a world to be able to promise that in a matter of months, or even in a couple of years, that we shall enter the promised land. The route is long and hard, but the long march has at last begun.
That first clip, Callaghan was discussing Britain had too long lived on borrowed time, borrowed ideas, borrowed money. What do you think in terms of the way that he was getting this idea across was important? That do you think it was just the repetition that things were borrowed, or do you think it was the focus in that line on time, ideas, money, that we needed a new direction?
Yeah, I find that clip fascinating because this is a guy who been there at the heart of the whole kind of post-war consensus, as we call it, essentially saying that we've been going wrong the whole time, which is as and I know we've had politicians, for example, Boris Johnson tried to kind of move on from this austerity era, and Liz Truss has tried to move on from the previous era. But I think that's a really kind of like frank and bold thing to do in that room, to say what we believed previously no longer exist. I think because we have to understand that it's trying to appeal to the markets as well, who are selling the pound massively at this point. He has to show them that there is going to be some sort of change. He has to get up there and make the speech that is going to reassure them that Britain is not going to carry on borrowing and spending and borrowing and spending and borrowing and spending.
Yeah. Absolutely.
Now, for the Labour Party, that is, quite a hard thing to do, because when they hear that speech, they think there's going to be some cuts. There's going to be a big program of nationalisation that the Labour Party was committed to from 1974 onwards. There's a real kind of juxtaposition between the totally different society that some people want and what Callaghan is trying to probably do, which is in a way preserve the status quo a little bit. You know, he's talking about massive changes to the way things are done, but in reality, it is so that, you know, we can maintain a good standard of living, a good manufacturing base. He's not talking in a Tony Benn style about, you know, ripping everything up. You know, and as Thatcher as well. So he's kind of got the kind of diagnosis right of where Britain's at, because you can see that we can't carry on like this. He's not getting up there and saying there's not going to be a problem if we carry on as we are. But at the same time, he's saying, so I think that speaks into it because it's borrowed time, you know, borrowed money. It's kind of a bit of a critique of himself and his own leadership over the years. And I wonder at the time whether people who were watching that thought, well, you're kind of talking about yourself, or whether they praised him and thought, actually, we need someone who's, you know, going to do this. But I think, yeah, that was the kind of, you know, there's a talk about a promised land in just after that, where he kind of admits that it's not going to be easy and it's not going to happen anytime soon, which again, I think is just a frankness that you probably wouldn't get from a politician today. He's talking about it's going to be hard for the next few years. It might only happen, you know, a decade or so down the line. So he's kind of laying the groundwork for some of the future things that would happen, you know, in the wider British economy there.
Yeah, absolutely. And also I think it's interesting the way that he actually delivers the speech as well, because you know, if you compare his delivery to, say, Harold Wilson, there's clear differences in style, isn't there?
Yeah, it's like I mean, they call it, like, I think Dominic Sandbrook talks about the gym facts of life, and he mentions facts of life a lot in this speech, and I think that's the kind of I think because he was you know, coming to the top, you know, the very top as in Prime Minister at a later point in life. No one was kind of expecting the kind of dynamism and radicalism that, you know, the young Wilson had. And I think it was in Alwyn Turner's book on the 70s where he talks about, you know, how Callaghan would still talk to, like, about young Tony Benn and all these people, even though they were in their 50s. And, you know, maybe only like a decade younger than him, even that. But it was like a kind of an image where he wanted to portray himself as elder statesman, stay fans, conservative with a small c. And it's the perfect kind of space for that. This speech, you just kind of feel reassured at a time when, you know, it's all going to hell in a handcart, and, you know, the economy's falling off a cliff, and Dennis Healy's having to turn around because he can't be out of the country for 17 hours, and they're about to negotiate, you know, the biggest, you know, loan from the IMF that's been given out. You can't really see a hint of panic there from him. And the crowd, on the audience as well, are just very much kind of like flattered, listening. They're not even shouting much. You know? It's like just or even clapping. So I think it suits his style. I think it's a very good style of speaking for a serious moment as this was.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm gonna we'll play another clip now.
Ever since the war, we've postponed facing up to fundamental choices and fundamental changes in our society and in our economy. That is what I mean when I say we've been living on borrowed time. For too long, this country, all of us, yes, this conference too, has been ready to settle for borrowing money abroad to maintain our standards of life instead of grappling with the fundamental problems of British industry. Governments of both parties have failed to ignite the fires of industrial growth in the ways that countries with very different political and economic philosophies have done. Germany, France and Japan. Different countries, different philosophies. We've failed whichever they adopted.
So in that clip, Callaghan compares Britain with Germany, France, Japan. What do you think he was trying to get across there by bringing up these particular countries?
Yeah, I found that a bit interesting because at this time he talked in the speech about having, you know, gone to Germany to study industrial relations there, and it's clear he's kind of, when he's describing the British decline, he's not talking about recapturing, you know, a lost golden age of British, you know, imperialism or nationalisation or economy. He's talking about new economies abroad that Britain should potentially mirror. You know, Germany, France, and Japan are the three that he mentioned, which I think is again a bit of a bold step to go in, because it's kind of moving Britain on from an old way of doing things into a new one. It's, you know, Britain is now in the European community. That is, you know, going to be central to what Britain's economic fortunes. So I think he's looking at different countries, different philosophies, and potentially opening Britain up to a different type of kind of social democracy, where you have, you know, a different relationship between the workers and the bosses. And I think at the heart of it, he's looking at how can, you know, workers, trade union leaders, bosses kind of work together to revitalize, you know, manufacturing industries, which is why he's looking at the kind of German model for that.
Yeah, absolutely. Just play another clip now, which I think is particularly interesting when we think about what's happening today.
If the government continues on its present course to pay for yet another short-lived consumer boom of the kind which used to buy success at the polls, or so we were told, but which never bought success in the world's markets or at the workplace.
So in that clip, Callaghan described the short-lived consumer boom. You know, the idea that we were told that this was the sort of thing that would be popular at the polls and that it would buy you success, but that it never did. I mean, that I think that probably anybody listening to that today might feel a certain resonance with what's been happening recently in politics, in the kind of seeming failures of economic orthodox and the failures of consumerism driving the economy. I mean, what do you think in terms of how it compares to today, but also what it says about the place Britain was in at the time when he made the speech?
Right, because Callaghan and Truss, when you think about it, they're quite similar in a sense of they're both trying to frame themselves a little bit as the outsiders, and probably do think of themselves as outsiders. Whether Liz Truss is justified or not, I'm not so sure. But Callaghan, for example, you know, makes a lot of virtue throughout his career of the fact that he didn't go to university in the way that, you know, your Tony Benns and your Crosslands and all these kind of you know, academic type people who wrote these great theories of Labour history and Labour politics. He doesn't really get on board with any of that. And when he kind of comes into power in 76, his kind of famous thing is that he's here and all these kind of educated people are not. He's got a very humble background, you know, different route to the top through the trade union movement that, you know, doesn't really exist anymore. And I think because of that, he kind of has a kind of, doesn't believe totally in treasury orthodoxy or, you know, theories in a way that some others are. So I think some of that, where he's talking about the short-lived consumer boom, is a kind of attack. You know, he has the line of, or so we were told. He's like, you know, all the experts and the commentary and the journalists and all the dons and all the clever people, as he would probably call them, have said things and they've never, you know, look where we are today. So he's framing himself as the kind of ordinary man in the room. And I think that's interesting on that one, because I think later as well, there were things he probably could have done, people say, to kind of save his premiership, more political manoeuvring to save the government, things he could have pulled economically. He never really did them, because I think he kind of, whether it was age, whether it was time, he got to a position where he kind of thought it's not worth doing it anymore. And there's you know, maybe that the time had come, you know, the famous comment about the sea and the change or whatever it was. I can't get to mind now, but edit that in later. But but you know, so that, I think that's kind of where he's coming from on that. And on the, you know, that's a criticism of the 1970s would have been, you know, about, you know, the Barber dash for growth and Healy's attempts to kind of inject stimulus into the economy, all kind of failing, just more and more inflation, and no one really working out what the problem was. And I think basically saying, look, we're not going to do what you think we're going to do and dash for growth here with more borrowing and more cutting of taxes. So I think that is a very good point, particularly when you relate to today, when we're kind of at a point where someone might need to make a similar speech about things. I mean, Liz Truss has said, she doesn't believe in treasury orthodoxy and gone one way, and someone might have to go another way at some point. So yeah, I think it's a fascinating comparison between the two.
Yeah, and also just on that point of Callaghan as an ordinary man, it's interesting kind of to compare him to his party at the time, isn't it? Because even going to 1979, 1980, after eventually losing the election, Callaghan is seen still as a fairly popular figure in comparison to his party. Do you think that had the party perhaps reflected a bit more of the charm that Callaghan was able to exude in his own very special way, that Labour might have done better in 79, or do you think that just because of events and because of his handling and the whole cabinet's handling of events, it was inevitable that Labour would lose the 79 election?
Yeah, it's one of them. I think, if you'd asked the country where they were at, they wanted to change, but they didn't want Margaret Thatcher as much as they wanted Callaghan. So it's like he was more popular than her, and that might be for many reasons. First female leader in as a front person for a kind of party. People didn't think she would have the ability to do it, but at the same, and lots of other factors around it. But at the same time, there was a kind of reassurance that Callaghan had and a respect for him that it only comes through being around and having that experience with people, but also kind of his personality, time and place. This time when we're going through the crisis, he was seen as the person, probably out of all the candidates, you think Tony Benn, Roy Jenkins, Crossland, Healy, who could have potentially navigated Britain through the IMF crisis and having to kind of keep this cabinet together. It can't really imagine Michael Foot being able to bring the government together on that, or Dennis Healy, or Tony Benn. So that's kind of, you can extrapolate that to the country as well, and that kind of he can, social conservatives were a supporter of him as well. So yeah, I think that's kind of a quality that we're probably missing a little bit in our politics these days, because there aren't any father of the nation type figures, because people just say today, gone tomorrow. They don't stick around long enough. If you think, if someone like, David Miliband or Andy Burnham or Ed Balls had stayed in politics for another decade after they kind of left Frontline, I know Burnham's still obviously on about there, but they could have a chance of, becoming Prime Minister in the 60s as Callaghan did. There would be maybe more substantial figures than what they will be today. But that's just the way that politics has gone, I suppose. But I think there's certainly a case for saying someone like Callaghan was needed at that point, a bit like Gordon Brown was in 2007. Having him in the room was much better for this country than if it had been David Miliband as a new Prime Minister and less experience.
Yeah, absolutely. I'd just like to play another clip now.
This time, we are not going for a consumer boom on borrowed money. We're going to invest it in our future. The cosy world, which we were told would go on forever, where full employment would be guaranteed by a stroke of the Chancellor's pen, cutting taxes, deficit spending, that cosy world is gone.
So in that clip, Callaghan talks about the cosy world we were told would go on forever, but that world has gone. How much of a resonance do you think that will have had for people watching, not just in the hall, but listening outside and maybe watching on TV? Do you think at the time when he made this speech, people would have felt, well, yeah, any cozy economic world really has gone for people in Britain?
Yeah, I think with the experience of industrial relations and obviously the falls of successive governments and what have you, the idea that Britain could kind of carry on as it was of its time. I mean, I think the Daily Mail, when Callaghan became Prime Minister, said that he was facing the biggest crisis of modern times, and that is in relation to unemployment, inflation, Northern Ireland, Britain's place in the world, all the things that are happening. So I think for him to say that the cozy world has gone, I don't think is probably that shocking. But I mean, from our perspective, it seems quite a surprise. You can't really imagine a politician going down that route today, even with all the kind of politics that we've been having and all the changes that occurred.
Yeah.
So I think, I know when this speech was given, the press did think that it was the right speech for the time, but they were obviously massively worried about the pound sterling, and that probably wasn't seeing that he'd done enough to avert that.
Just play another clip now.
When we reject unemployment as an economic instrument, as we do, and when we reject also superficial remedies, as socialists must, then we must ask ourselves unflinchingly, what is the cause of high unemployment? Quite simply and unequivocally, it is caused by paying ourselves more than the value of what we produce. There are no scapegoats. This is as true in a mixed economy under a Labour government as it is under capitalism or under communism. It's an absolute fact of life which no government, be it left or right, can alter. Of course, in Eastern Europe, you can't price yourself out of your job because you can't withdraw your labour.
So in that section, in that extract, he compares Britain with Eastern Europe. You can't price yourself out of a job, too high prices, that kind of thing. Do you think, even though that the Cold War was not quite as hot as it had been a decade earlier, that there was still this feeling of a need to compare Western Europe with the East, with the USSR, whether positively or negatively?
Yeah, I think that was an interesting line that I found, and I think that is essentially a coded attack at the kind of left wingers in the room who were still kind of talking about Russia and how you could create an economy and how you could create full employment. He actually says, in these countries, it's not possible to go on strike, so therefore you can't possibly have, a certain level of unemployment. And I think, even though he's not renowned as a prime minister that did much on foreign affairs, he'd been foreign secretary. He had the kind of gravitas to talk about these issues. And I think you've got to think as the kind of opposition leader, and Margaret Thatcher was quite new, that when he kind of talked on these issues and the threat that Russia still posed, that was kind of an easy win for him to kind of, use his experience again. So I think that's kind of, double-edged, in the room to the people who he calls the Trotskyites. He's kind of like framing himself against them, but he's also showing that he's kind of remember that I was foreign secretary and I've got a knowledge of the world at the same time.
And of course that internal battle in the Labour Party that really erupted a decade later, it's beginning to start, isn't it? In many ways, it's not quite as bad as it will be from 1980 onwards. But I mean, how aware do you think Callaghan was that he had to try and balance the party in the same way that Wilson had tried to do, the need to, as Wilson said, keep the charabang moving, because when it stops, everybody gets off and has a fight.
Yeah. Well, you've got to remember that this is the kind of the real disappointment and disillusionment with Labour governments is kind of at its peak, or getting towards its peak here, because you've had the wins in 1964 and 1966, and many people in the party on the left in the trade union movement didn't think that was a successful government. It's been quite revised in recent years for its social reforms on women's pay and homosexuality and the death penalty. But actually, at the time, it was completely, despised. And you're getting this kind of towards this moment of reflection where lots of more kind of people have, some would say, infiltrated the party, but also a lot of people have just, young people with new ideas about how the economy should be run, how society should be run, not really bothered about the kind of Keynesian, economic world, the coziness that we talked about. So you're kind of getting that clash happening, within the Labour Party. You're getting Tony Benn, who's rising as a figure at this point, it's kind of bringing a lot of these different forces together. And Callaghan, although he kind of appeals to some people in the country, a lot of people in the country, he's not very popular within the party, within the members. MPs are behind him, but the grassroots are now thinking, what is this guy for? We've had opportunities, we've had failure after failure after failure on, a range of issues. And this speech to them would have probably been seen as, ushering in what Margaret Thatcher later did. And that's kind of, in the 80s, what he was kind of criticised for was that the failure of this government to tackle this crisis and use it to their advantage in a way that they think Margaret Thatcher did. He was kind of what they call, the keeper of the cloth cap, the keeper of the old way of doing things when the 1980s was going to be very, very different. So he's trying to keep them together. He's obviously got the experience of the party, and in this speech he's trying to do that. But yeah, you can tell from the way that Dennis Healey is then attacked or criticised the next day for his speech, that there's a deep unease in the room at what they're trying to do.
I'm going to negotiate with the IMF on the basis of our existing policies, not changes in policies. And I need your support to do it. But when I say existing policies, I mean things we don't like as well as things we do like. It means sticking to the very painful cuts in public expenditure on which the government's already decided. It means sticking to a pay policy which enables us, as the TUC resolved a week or two ago, to continue the attack on inflation. It means seeing that the increase in our output, which has now begun, goes not into public or private spending, but into exports or investment. That's what it means, and that's what I'm asking for. That's what I'm going to negotiate for, and I ask the conference to support me in that cause.
So we're going to play another clip now, and it's probably the most famous, or one of the most famous lines from the speech.
We used to think that you could spend your way out of a recession and increase employment by cutting taxes and boosting government spending. I tell you in all candour that that option no longer exists, and that insofar as it ever did exist, it only worked on each occasion since the war by injecting a bigger dose of inflation into the economy on every occasion, followed by a higher level of unemployment as the next step. Higher inflation followed by higher unemployment. We've just escaped from the highest rate of inflation this country has known. We have not yet escaped from the consequences of the high unemployment. That's the history of the last 20 years.
So in that part of the speech, that famous part of the speech, you can really see that Callaghan is wanting to drive home his point as much as possible, injecting a bigger dose of inflation into the economy on every occasion, higher inflation followed by higher unemployment. He's really sending his message home, isn't he? And it's at this point, I think, that you can really see the kind of direction that he wants to go in terms of the composing of that particular bit of the speech. What do you know? What sort of like process there was for it, and how much influence Callaghan had with composing that particular part of it?
Yeah, I think that particular part was done by his son-in-law Peter Jay a lot, and it according to the Donahue diaries. And I think some people, I think Dennis Healey thought he overstepped the mark with that. Obviously, and I think Donahue talks about all the monetarists have got to him. So he must have kind of either been talking about them, reading about them, around that period, as you say, the kind of newspapers are talking about it a bit more, and the political think tanks talking about it a bit more. So this is kind of a theory that people think its time has come. I mean, looking back over the speech, I was kind of surprised at which point it kind of came, because you always just remember that famous clip that's kind of inserted. It's kind of just, I don't think you could probably have expected it to be as big as it become. It just comes in quite a big 20-minute bit on the economy. And he talks, he comes back to it, but it's that kind of bit that is always replayed and remembered. And I think because it kind of encapsulates what was going to happen and what inevitably, history written by the winners and all that sort of stuff. The fact that Britain did have to change course under Thatcher then makes them words a lot more prescient, because Labour obviously had a lot of time struggling to come to terms with what happened. And even though, as you say, if you look at the speech in its full, and I urge people to go and have a look on YouTube and look at it, there's lots in there about the revitalization of manufacturing industry, a commitment to full employment. The revival of British industry will be, is it able to happen? We can compete with these countries, but these are the steps that we need to do. And one of them is obviously borrowing. I mean, at the same time, he's obviously got his head thinking about the IMF negotiations and other creditors and not spooking them. He has to basically reassure them that he's serious, tough, going to bring in spending cuts. This is a speech that is essentially outlining a different direction, but one that can settle the markets as well. And I don't know, sadly, we don't know whether he knew that was going to be the big speech. If you look at the papers, they do talk about borrowed time a little bit more, and saving the pound. But that bit I found, is obviously the most iconic bit, and one that'll outlive us probably in terms of looking back at British history and turning points.
Now we've got to get back to fundamentals. First, overcoming unemployment now unambiguously depends on our labour costs being at least comparable to those of our major competitors. Second, we can only become competitive by having the right kind of investment at the right kind of level, and by significantly improving the productivity of both labour and capital. Third, we will fail, and I say this to those who've been pressing about public expenditure, which I'll come back to again, we will fail if we think we can buy our way out by printing what Dennis Healey calls confetti money to pay ourselves more than we produce.
So in that part of the speech, Callaghan refers to we can't buy ourselves out by printing confetti money. I mean, that part I think particularly resonated with me, because it seems very much directed at a certain section of the audience, doesn't it?
Yeah, exactly. And I think that's the problem. The kind of left-wing argument that we could stimulate the economy, and that we wouldn't need to cut anything and we could create different things. That is an attack on them, and that kind of, again, it comes back to the reason why he's making this speech. It has to be quite tough on the idea that Britain can kind of print its way out of this recession or crisis, because the pound is taking a massive hit, and that's a kind of symbolic blow. A few more months before Callaghan was Prime Minister, I think it goes to $2 for a pound, which seems completely crazy now, but it was a shock to the system that it got to that level. And there was a kind of, I think on the day that he did the speech, the front page are like another 4 cents off the dollar to the pound. So this is like a big story, and a kind of a symbolic story of British decline. It matters that the currency is on the slide in a way that we probably have. I mean, it's weird because it kind of feels like it matters at the moment, but for a long time in this country, even with the whole Brexit, vote and the things that happened to currency, I don't think people felt it in the way that Callaghan felt it. Now he obviously had a new valuation; he had to resign as Chancellor. It's hit on his mind, but there is a clear, the confetti money, I think, comes from that position of not wanting to have another economic crisis, and that's the thing that kind of guides him and has guided him and spooked him, for a lot of his political life, as it did for many in Labour, I was saying in the beginning, due to the fact of what happened in the 1930s.
Yeah, absolutely. I would just like to play another clip here.
The willingness of industry to invest in new plant and machinery requires, of course, that we overcome inflation, but also that industry is left with sufficient funds and has sufficient confidence to make the new investment. When I say they must have sufficient funds, I mean they must be able to earn a surplus. And that's a euphemism for saying they must be able to make a profit. And whether you call it a surplus or a profit, it's necessary for a healthy industrial system, whether it operates in a socialist economy, a mixed economy, or a capitalist economy. And if industry cannot retain and generate sufficient funds as a result of its operations and replace old plant and machinery, then you'll whistle in vain for the investment and we shall continue to slide downhill. These are elementary facts of life. They're known to every trade unionist. Who would they sooner go and negotiate with when they want an increase in pay? A firm that's bankrupt or a firm that's doing well and generating a good surplus? The primary concern of our industrial strategy and our economic policy for the next 3 years is quite simple. The strategy and the priority is to create more wealth.
And in that section of the speech, Callaghan, I think, makes a really interesting point in terms of saying that it is necessarily in a socialist, mixed or capitalist, system economy, you will whistle in vain for investment. And when he discusses as well trade unionists, I think he's really connecting with his own roots, isn't he? And I think it is a bit of the speech that, I mean, I don't know how you feel, but it's a part of it that does seem to come from the heart. He's someone who, as he said earlier on, had risen to become Prime Minister through the ranks of the trade unions and from a humble background compared to some of the other occupants of Number 10. And this does seem, to me at least, to him wanting to get across, this is the right thing to do. I believe this is the right thing to do.
Yeah, and you're right, and it's also interesting because it comes at the moment where trade unions are changing and there's changes in leadership in trade unions and they're moving into a more kind of left-wing, extra-parliamentary, direction. And I think on his mind would have been the criticism that doesn't really understand the trade union movement and all the rest of it. And he, as he says, every good trade union, would sooner negotiate with a company that has a surplus than one that has no profit. And it's weird that you have to kind of say that at a Labour Party conference, but it just have to be reasserted that profit isn't really a dirty word, because actually he's trying to make the point that rather than governments continually bailing out industries, if we can get them to make a surplus, and there should be more jobs and the rest of it. I mean, I think him using his trade union experience is a kind of nod to the people in the room that, he has been around the bush, because, and again, the relationship with the trade unions at this point is the thing that people are going to save, not just the government, but the country.
Yeah.
If trade unions and industry and government can work together, they can fix Britain's problems. And it seems like a bit of an alien kind of concept to this generation, potentially, that the trade unions will be an integral part of it. But as we know, as history people know, that they were. And they particularly were in this situation because they have to kind of be part of the pay policy that Callaghan's going to implement.
Yeah.
So it's kind of a nod to them that, I understand what trade unions want. They want companies that do well, and it's easy to negotiate with a company that's doing well than isn't.
Yeah, absolutely. I'd like to turn now to looking at the impact of the speech at the time. When Callaghan had finished giving the speech, what was the sense of how people responded to it, people thought of it? What did they feel about it?
Yeah, it's interesting because I've had a look at the kind of archives for this speech in the past and for different things, and it kind of a little bit slips under the radar because a lot of things are happening at that moment. And I think the fact that Healy's meant to go out to the Philippines for this IMF conference, and can't because he's worried about being in the air for 17 hours. That's the kind of news story. He then has to obviously famously, make a speech to conference. He's not meant to speak, so he has to speak as a delegate or whatever it was, and do it from the rostrum and wait his turn. And I think there was a real sense that this speech wasn't going to be enough and that it was just words essentially, and that actually the proof would be in whether the markets were stabilized, whether we would get that loan from the IMF. I think straight away the pound continued to slide. It wasn't a speech that turned things around in that moment. I think what's interesting for the kind of historian looking at it is just how it kind of sets the scene for the next period, which is kind of like moving on from the kind of Keynesian era and into the kind of Thatcher years. I think, once Britain does enter those IMF negotiations and they do get that loan, there is like an improvement in the economy. The speech in that sense does its job. It gets him to, the autumn and gets them to the negotiation table. Had he gone a different route, been more combative with the markets or with the party or the government, who knows what would happen? The IMF might have took a different course. They might have been more spooked, but Healy was able to get that negotiation, and you kind of see the balance of payments come down. There's a negotiation. There's an agreement with the trade unions on pay policy, and there's the prospect of North Sea oil, which is kind of like keeping people excited to the point of as we discussed, by a couple of years later, he's ahead in the polls and people are saying it's time to call an election.
And I mean, I think we touched upon it a bit, but the way that the speech has been represented over time is obviously somewhat different. I mean, how do you think people looking back at the speech now and in the decade subsequent from when Callaghan gave it, assess the speech and think of it?
Yeah, because I think Callaghan's had a bit of a kind of revival. I think there's a book that came out recently, which was a retrospective, a good one, which was about him being an underrated prime minister that, was battling these huge economic crises. I mean, he's probably the first. He's seen as the first, prime minister to really recognise that the old way of doing things wasn't going to be able to be done anymore, and that had to massively change. That probably came looking at it from an economic perspective that he had, that Britain wasn't going to be able to maintain, levels of borrowing. But at the same time, he wasn't at the position where he was going to trade that off for, massive, cuts in employment. He talks a lot in this speech about the things that we need to do to revitalise the economy. And there are a lot of things that did happen, about better investment from abroad, better training in skills, moving from, the old manufacturing base, bringing in computers. Like, I think Dom Sandbrook, has argued that he was the person who kind of like pushed for computers in schools a lot more, and she was the one that benefited from that. So he's kind of ahead of the game on some curves, recognise change, but at the same time he's wedded to that old way of doing things. So he's kind of an in-betweener. He's a massive tail end figure. But what he will be remembered for is probably this speech, that'll last it, because it's kind of ushering in the new era of British politics, and the one that actually, did win out. The settlement for a long time was the one that was created after him. And, people say, was he the first monetarist? I'm not sure about that. As I say, there's holes in the argument, but the kind of diagnosis of Britain in decline is just there all the way through that speech.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I think that's a great note to end on. Thank you for taking the time to speak to me about this speech, Anthony. Most people listening, I will imagine, probably already follow you on Twitter, but if the people who don't, where should they go to follow you?
You're interested in more Callaghan stuff? Just go, tideshistory.com, where we have loads of good writers, and any of your listeners who want to write as well, feel free to drop me an email on that site. Always looking for new young writers who are interested in stuff. And then obviously through Twitter on the Tides of History, it's Labour_history for lots of different stuff on Labour politics and different things. So yeah, look out for that if you haven't seen it.
Excellent. Thanks again for coming on the podcast.
Pleasure.